Good morning. I am once again honored to be with you, my friends. Gathering with this community is a privilege on any day, in whatever ways we're able to do so. How much more special on this day, when our hearts and minds are attuned to commemorating and celebrating the gifts of mothering. It is fitting that we pause in thanksgiving for those people in our lives who have brought us thus far, some of us from a mighty long way. We pause in thanksgiving for those people who opened themselves to the transformative possibilities that inevitably flow from the process of nurturing life. And we pause in joy and in fervent supplication for the wisdom and strength to share the gifts of mothering love in whatever ways we can, wherever we are called to do so. I would like to share briefly from a very special story, one that allows us to glimpse the possibilities of mothering relationships. And this is a story from the Gospel of Matthew. As the story goes, Jesus was very busy as he always was, crossing boundaries, overturning tables, prophesizing, ignoring rules, intentionally troublemaking. In fact, he was so persistently disruptive, so intentionally troublemaking, so often disturbing the peace, that at one point his family thought he had lost his mind. On this particular day, his family came looking for him, but they could not reach him because he was surrounded by crowds, disciples, probably some enemies, perhaps some groupies, maybe even a few sensation seekers or rubberneckers. However, someone got the message to him. Your mother and your brothers are outside. It was like being tapped on the shoulder and someone saying, man, your mom is out there looking for you. Now, for most of us, just hearing that our mom has managed to track us down while we are out in the street would be enough to make us hit the brakes, or maybe just slow our roll a little bit. But not Jesus. He turned and replied, who is my mother? Who is my mother? These are 4 words we will never find on a Hallmark card. I suspect many of us have dawdled over those cards every year, trying to find just the right words to celebrate Mother's Day. This card says too much. This one doesn't say enough. Perhaps she wouldn't think this one is funny at all. And maybe that is exactly as it should be, because most of us don't live in those flowery, perfume-scented relationships imaged on greeting cards. If we are fortunate, we live in mothering relationships of caring and compassion that is textured with conflict and complexity. And if we're truthful, some of those profoundly transformative mothering relationships are lived outside of the boundaries of biological family. All too often, what we say about mother love is hallmarked or sentimentalized. Flowers, frothy verses, and syrupy tweets are fine, but we must remember sentimentality serves a political function. So perhaps the question, who is my mother, is one that might serve us well. This question might expand our consciousness and cause us to interrogate the sentimental fictions that disguise, distract, and deflect our attention from the truths we live every day. Anything that can be sentimentalized can be weaponized. Anything that can be sentimentalized, can be weaponized to serve and protect the inequities of a culture stratified by race, by sexuality, by gender, by class. Anything that can be sentimentalized can be weaponized to serve and protect the cruelties of a culture, stratified by any of the myriad fault lines we humans construct to separate the deserving from the undeserving, the commendable from the contemptible. These fault lines are essential to the scaffolding that undergird cultures of cruelty. In fact, sentimentality is a source of sustenance for cultures of cruelty. Let me offer an example. In Nazi Germany, Mother's Day was a day of grand celebration. There were parades and festivities and prizes. Aryan motherhood was a patriotic duty, and women, Aryan women, were awarded the Mother's Cross based on the number of children they could produce for the nation. The Bronze Cross for 4 children, silver for 6 children, and a gold cross if the mother bore 8 or more children. This is a quote from one of the celebrated women. "I was so proud. There was a big celebration where all the mothers were invited for coffee and cake." Now, of course, this weaponized sentimentality would have dissipated rather quickly had the only payoffs been coffee and cake and fluffy honorifics. Like any other variety of predatory power, this version was cemented in place through systemic design. These Aryan mothers gained easier access to housing, nursing assistance, and even tax cuts. Of course, we must acknowledge that these women were themselves subjugated, constrained by the demands of a vicious supremacist patriarchy. However, to succumb to the seductions of sentimentality, to be proud, was to be complicit with the violence and degradations of that vicious supremacist culture. To succumb to the seductions of honored status was to make peace with the lies that elevate commendable women above those contemptible women. To succumb to the seductions was to entrap oneself in the delusion that to be an Aryan mother was to be much more deserving than women who were Jews or women who were lesbian. It was to make peace with the lie that they were perhaps a little more human than women who were called gypsy, or women who were marked by any attribute of personhood deemed unfit by Nazi powers. This question, who is my mother, upends cultural norms about the measures of human value and the boundaries of human belonging. And it is as relevant today as it was 2 millennia ago. Today, the question might be phrased as, whose mothers matter? And in conjunction with that question, whose children matter? Though the question itself is rarely articulated, the answer is legislated through our governments, enacted through our institutions, normalized by our culture, and all too often consecrated by our places of worship. I want to share with you an encounter I had at my mother's graveside. During the service, I had noticed an elderly white gentleman who was weeping copiously. He was still sobbing when he walked up to me at the grave and introduced himself. He told me that on his office wall, he had a picture of himself as a toddler standing between two women, one his birth mother, and the other was my birth mother. The caption under his picture read, "My two mamas." I knew in that moment that we shared a deep grief, but neither of us could know the true texture of the other's loss. I knew that she had nurtured him through his childhood. She had offered him affection and wise counsel in adulthood as he became a father and then a grandfather. For over 60 years, she had provided the cooking, cleaning, and child care for him, his three other siblings, and their parents. In his words, she made their house a real home. He went on to say that he would never forget the sumptuous feast she prepared for them on holidays. During this graveside moment, it struck me that I had never spent an entire Christmas day with my mother until I was an adult with a daughter of my own. Just so we don't get this twisted, I enjoyed very happy Christmases as a child. I never had an unhappy Christmas. The best part of the day was waking up and ripping through all of the stuff. And my mother somehow managed to make sure I had plenty of stuff. We would go through the presents under the tree, but by early in the morning, I was trundled off with my coloring books, my dolls, and perhaps a chemistry set to spend the rest of the day with my great-grandmother. The second best part of the day was seeing my mother return, walking down the hill, carrying bags of leftovers from the feast that she had prepared for this man's family. During that graveside moment, I understood that his family's claim on my mother's service on Christmas Day or any other holiday was simply non-negotiable. This ritual was an unremarkable fact of life. My mother's assigned place in the world was to be available to the family whose needs for comfort, convenience, and togetherness somehow invalidated any claim she might harbor as a mother to be with her daughter. In that world of racial apartheid, our relationship simply did not matter. Whose mothers matter? Whose children matter? These are not new questions. They're just questions we rarely articulate out loud. And not asking the questions allows us to escape the hard truths about the answers. Throughout our history as a nation, we've answered this unarticulated question through policy decisions, legislative enactments, and cultural norms that widen the fault line, separating the mothers and children who are deserving of safety, support, and sustenance from those who, frankly, are deemed not deserving. Our third president was completely unapologetic about his role in this culture of cruelty. According to Thomas Jefferson, ripping families apart was not cruel because slaves were incapable of sentiment or expressing love. The trail of tears is continuous from the Native American children forcibly removed from their parents for their own good. As some said, to kill the Indian and serve the man. The trail of tears is continuous to the children who are caged in concentration camps along the southern border right now as we celebrate Mother's Day. Not all cruelty is made for TV or body cameras. The fact that it goes unnoticed and unarticulated does not make it less real, however. COVID-19 isn't the only real virus in this country. There is a virus of cruelty that makes food insecurity and poisoned water a completely acceptable reality for non-deserving children. Limited access to health care? What else might these non-deserving children expect? There is a virus of cruelty that condones the public shaming of children. Up until the end of 2019, some states could require children to clean up the school cafeteria in order to deserve a hot meal. They had to earn their place at the table by cleaning up after their peers. It is as if they were being blamed for not having enough intrauterine foresight to avoid being born into a poor family. When we wax sentimental about motherhood, we obscure the hard truths about who we are meant to be, and who we can become. The sentimental narratives make us susceptible to the delusions of privatization, and the privatization narratives demarcate the boundaries of our relationships, reducing motherhood to something like ownership of private property, relationship as property, property which, when dutifully and carefully cultivated, yields bumper sticker children. These children then signify our human value and secure our status within the boundaries of the deserving. Privatizing the mothering relationship allows us to believe that our children are entitled to safety, support, and sustenance because they are ours. The others, they're somebody else's responsibility. When we adopt the narrative of mothering as private ownership, we are left with a very anemic spirituality, a constricted imagination of who we can be in the world. We can be more, and we can do more. When Jesus asked, "Who is my mother?" he was inviting us to expand our sense of purpose and our sense of mattering. He never said, "That woman out there is not my mother." Instead, he looked at the men and the women gathered around him and said, "These people are my mother, my brothers, and my sisters." He was inviting us into a liberating spirituality, a spirituality that empowers us to transgress, to cross the boundaries that shape our imagination of who we can be in the world. No one exemplifies this invitation to love more powerfully than Mrs. Mamie Till Bradley, the mother of Emmett Till. These are Mrs. Bradley's own words. 2 months ago, I had a nice apartment in Chicago. I had a good job. I had a son. And when something happened to those Negroes in the South, I said, "That's their business, not mine." Now I know how wrong I was. The murder of my son has shown me that what happens to any of us, anywhere in the world, had better be the business of us all. Anyone who has ever seen the iconic picture of Mamie Bradley wailing over her dead son's coffin will never doubt the magnitude of her grief. Although she had been warned against showing the brutalized body of her son, Mrs. Bradley opened the coffin to make the hard truths of racial savagery visible to the world. When we look at that iconic picture, when we see this heartbroken mother, we're not surprised to learn that she later devoted her life to resisting injustice, teaching, and speaking at anti-lynching rallies. Few of us, however, could ever have anticipated how her love would grow. So often when we speak of grief, especially grief arising out of tragic injustice, we talk about needing closure. Mrs. Bradley's grief led her to openness. Her deep connection to her son opened her desire to connect to all people. Again, in her own words, I did not hate my son's killers. I could have taken their 4 little children and raised them as my own, and I would have loved them. Imagine this boundary crossing love, a love that refuses to be defeated by hatred, a love that refuses to be defined by the social norms or the political exigencies of the day. This boundary crossing love expands our consciousness. This boundary crossing mother love liberates us to live our deepest truth as creatures on this planet. The truth that ultimately we all belong to each other. This is the truth that transforms cultures of cruelty into cultures of compassion. This boundary crossing mothering love is a call to action. And again, to borrow Mrs. Bradley's words, it is the business of us all. Mothering love is not confined to gender essentialism. Certainly, it is not the exclusive province of heterosexual cisgender women. It is the business of us all of us who belong to each other in whatever bodies, however gendered, with whomever we love. It is an all-encompassing embrace that expands our imagination from mothering as a function of bloodlines into mothering mattering because of love lines. On this Mother's Day, I would like to leave you with another story about mothering love as I have come to know it through my mother. We started earlier talking about the elderly white gentleman who wept at my mother's funeral. I have no doubt that she loved him too. I actually remember her talking about him, always with fondness. But there was a reason I had never met him. You see, she loved me too. And that love led her to protect me and nurture not just my physical being, but also my imagination and my spiritual being. Her love for him did not blind her to the political realities of the racial apartheid world. In this world of racial apartheid, bonds of affection could do little to countermand the dictates of white supremacy. So, as best she could, she protected me from the world that was systemically and specifically designed to limit my imagination of who I could be and where I belonged. There was another young man in my mother's life, this one a child that I will call Sammy. Sammy was a kid with developmental disabilities who grew up in my neighborhood. I really don't know if he was a few years older or a few years younger than I. I just knew that he was the only child of parents who were either falling down or passed out drunk by early afternoon every Saturday. The truth was that his mother and his father were too ravaged by their own demons to properly provide anything beyond the material essentials for Sammy. Whether my mother had to work on weekends or not, Saturday evening suppers were always a big deal in our home. and Sammy always had a place at the table. When he took his seat at the table, he knew he was not an object of pity. In fact, he was not even a guest. If the meal was delayed for any reason, he would knock on the door and ask when his supper would be ready. In later years, my mother and I would laugh about the time Sammy looked at her as if she had lost her mind. He said, "Miss Mary Lou, what's wrong with you? You forgot to put my cornbread on my plate." In other words, Sammy belonged. He didn't have to earn a seat. He had a rightful place at the welcome table, our family table. When his meal was over, he might hang out on the porch with my mother and chit chat with her for a while. Then he would go home to the parents who loved him as best they were able. My mother couldn't fix his parents, but she could acknowledge them as a part of our human family. She could support them by caring for their son. When mothering love is a call to action, when mothering connects us through love lines, truly no child is left behind. Mothering love calls us into an all encompassing embrace of purpose, passion, and possibility. Mothering love reminds us of the truths that we not only belong to each other, but also that our connectedness makes us co-creators of this world. And through acts of co-creation, we can transform cultures of cruelty into cultures of compassion. Mothering love invites us to this day as a celebration of doing love, love made real, not sentimental. When we embrace the challenge of living these truths, Mother's Day is a celebration rooted in the reality that every child is our child, then truly no child is left behind. Love and blessings to all of you on this day and every day.